Once all three castings have been finished to the rubber wheel stage and no facetting is present, you're ready to proceed with the indexing for soldering. The first step in the soldering procedure is to relate the three castings to one another. You will perform a two-step soldering procedure, and in order to relate the ponic to the molar, which will be the first soldering procedure, you need to use your buckle index that you made earlier. Try in what position the index will fit back on the model. You may have to jiggle the removable die somewhat, and depending a little bit on how much you polished, you may or may not have a perfect seal all the way along the buckle aspect. Try, however, to position the index as accurately as you possibly can. When you're satisfied with its position, you can use a little sticky wax to lute it in place against the adjacent teeth. The index should be solid in position and should not shift or come loose during the subsequent procedure. Once loaded in place, you should now be able to reposition the ponic with the little dot on the buckle surface back into the index and its proper position in the arch. Remember that when you cut off the button of the ponic, you should have left a small portion of the sprue sticking out to facilitate the soldering procedure. When you're satisfied that the ponic is accurately positioned, use a small amount of sticky wax to lute the ponic along the incisal aspect or occlusal aspect of the index. Hold it in place and allow the sticky wax to set for approximately 30 seconds before releasing the ponic. Some Vaseline is applied to the occlusal surfaces with the help of a cotton roll, and it's probably wise to also extend this onto the exposed portion of the index. An additional piece of Mortite is subsequently adapted to the lingual surfaces, and what you're really striving for is to create a small platform that will support the plaster that will be used to make an occlusal index. Basically, we will make a stone impression of the occlusal surfaces of the molar and the ponic, and this index will have to extend roughly until the middle of the three-quarter crown and the middle of the occlusal surface of the molar. It's okay if it extends a little further, but it should at least extend that far. Once again, a creamy mix of stone is used and carefully placed on top of the occlusal surfaces of the castings we are trying to relate to one another. The Vaseline, of course, serves as a separating medium. This is probably a little on the runny side, but as it sets, be sure to build the index up until you have obtained a thickness of probably about ½ an inch. Usually that will suffice. Give it a few seconds until the stone sets, and try to already flatten off the top a little so that it will, when inverted, sit easily on a bench top. Once the stone of the index has completely set, remove it with a gently rocking motion. It is a good idea to support the dies and the castings at this time. It is quite common for one or several of the castings to be retained in the occlusal index if the mortite has not been placed beyond the height of contour initially. If that happens, carefully use a sharp instrument such as a Bart Parker or a scalpel blade to remove any excess. At this time, the depth of the indentations is reduced by carefully scraping it to make it easier to verify later that the castings will have been accurately repositioned in the index. After the indentations are only minimal, the excess material around it can be removed through the use of a model trimmer. It is important to retain approximately 3 to 4 millimeters around the area of the castings that will be placed in the index. A premolar's width typically suffices. After it has been trimmed, you can proceed and place the castings into the index. Make absolutely sure that no small particles prevent the full seating of the retainer and the pontic. Carefully inspect circumferentially, and no gap should be visible. Once satisfied, you can use an instrument to make sure that the casting remains in place during solidification of the sticky wax that you will now use to lute them in place. Apply the sticky wax along the entire periphery of the castings and support them during the solidification process. Typically that'll take about 30 seconds or so. Once the castings are luted in place, we have to seal off the area of the proposed connector. We will be using different colors wax. It is not that critical, but it will show a little better. And make sure when you apply this wax with a conventional waxing instrument that you seal off the entire area of the connector. A small error here might result in investment entering into the solder joint area and could interfere with a successful soldering procedure. Clean any excess wax off the margins with a carver so that the margins themselves will be covered by the soldering investment. In order to separate the soldering assembly from the index, we coat the entire surface with some wax. In this case, we're using sprue wax, and this will prevent the two from sticking together after we have poured the soldering investment around the castings. A bit of sprue wax held against a very warm instrument will allow you to do this relatively rapidly. make certain the entire surface is covered. The next step is forming the airways, and we will use soft wax. In this case, we're using a little bit of beeswax, and we'll shape it into a little cone, a funnel-like shape, because that is the configuration we're trying to create in the soldering investment itself. Take two little cones like this and place them with their pointed end towards the proposed connector area, and remove the excess that sticks out away from the index with a warm instrument. And now we can go ahead and place a cone just like this on the other side. And blend the cones of beeswax with the other wax that has been applied. Typically, you'll have to add a little. Sometimes you can just melt the beeswax. Until an exact shape has been arrived at that you want to duplicate in your soldering assembly. Make sure that the little dot and the remainder of the sprue are not covered with wax at this time. They serve to increase the retention in the soldering assembly. Same is repeated on the other side. And any excess wax that has come too close to the margin is removed with a carver. Typically, a millimeter of the casting immediately adjacent to the margin should be free of wax. The entire assembly is then boxed, and over light vibration we can feed the soldering investment into the assembly. Be very careful not to trap any air bubbles on the inside of your casting. Any air trapped inside of the casting may result in a bubble that will act as a heat sink, and this may cause your casting to melt during the soldering procedure. So be very careful not to trap any bubbles. Also, do not exaggerate on the vibration, since that might jar your castings out of the index. Attention to detail really pays off here. Then you can fill the entire boxed in area and allow the material to set. After the investment has set, you can cut into the boxing wax and remove it. Do not try to separate the assembly from the index through force of hand, but rather use one of the boil-out tanks, and by submerging the assembly in boiling water, the wax will soften and will be eliminated. Once it is softened, you can gently separate the two components and then resubmerge the soldering assembly until all wax has been eliminated. No wax should remain before you proceed with the next step. You can remove the assembly, and after it has cooled, eliminate any small fins of investment material that might break off or chip off. and complete the funnel-like configuration of the airways on both lingual and buccal aspect of the assembly. You may wish to also round off the block somewhat, but whenever you scrape and carve, prevent any material from getting into the connector area. Any investment trapped there will likely interfere with the successful soldering procedure and probably will result in having to repeat the procedure. So tap any particles off, and you can use a little piece of unwaxed floss to remove any particles that air pressure will not eliminate for you. It's a good idea to reduce the size of the overall assembly. This will make it easier to rapidly heat it up, and rounding of the corner areas is easily accomplished, again, with a carving instrument of your choice. Note the shape of the airway, which will allow us to concentrate the heat in the area of the proposed connector where we need it during the soldering procedure. Prior to inserting the assembly in the oven, we remove any remaining particles with a soft brush, and we have to apply some soldering flux. Clean it off immediately prior to application of the flux, again with some unwaxed floss. The gap size should be approximately 1/4 of a millimeter. We will use a paste flux, and it's probably easiest applied with the thin waxing instrument of your Peter K. Thomas set. The connector area should be filled with flux, but care should be taken not to use an excessive amount, since it may interfere after the soldering procedure with other steps. This is about the right amount. The assembly is then placed in a burnout oven and heated to approximately 900 degrees. At that time, it is placed over a Bunsen burner, and the soldering procedure begins by using a properly adjusted flame and heating the base of the assembly. Try to use the blue tip of the flame. If you're too close, you'll see a black dot appear on the assembly, so in that case, back off a little and try to use the tip of the blue portion of the flame, the reducing portion, and keep the torch in motion. Move it back and forth as you heat the assembly. Remember, it takes more heat to warm up the pontic, since there's more bulk of metal in that area. A small cube of solder has been placed over the connector area, and observe that cube of solder very closely during this procedure. The castings should adopt a cherry red glow, and you will see the solder form an initial bridge between the two components. As soon as you see that happen, direct the torch more into the area of the airway to concentrate the heat in the connector area and draw the solder in between the two castings. If you overheat one of the two components, the solder will flow onto the occlusal surface rather than into the connector area. So as soon as you see that happen, adjust the direction of your flame accordingly. A complete meniscus between the two components must be formed. And in order to ensure this, it is helpful, as soon as you see the connector form, to direct the torch from the airway onto the connector and then approach the connector from the occlusal and from the lingual with that reducing tip of the flame. Upon completion of the procedure, inspect that a complete connector has been formed before removing the investment. It is still possible at this time to go back. Note that a complete solder joint has indeed been formed. The casting is again pickled after it has been removed from the investment through quenching and is now returned to the master cast. Once satisfied that the soldering procedure was indeed accurate, you're ready to proceed and take the two components to your patient for indexing for the second connector. After the castings have been positioned on the dentiform and the fit has been verified, we will use some Duralay resin to make the second index. Some liquid is carried into the connector area, and typically capillary action will concentrate the monomer in that area. Next, apply a little bead of the resin, and the trick here really is moisture control. With proper moisture control, it'll be relatively easy to seal off the entire connector area. You can move the material around a bit with the tip of a brush and then apply some additional material to build it up into sufficient bulk to allow for some rigidity. In order to prevent dislodging of the castings, it may be helpful to build the assembly onto the occlusal surfaces of both ponic and premolar by placing a little additional material into those areas to give it an occlusal arm of some substance. And the advantage of the Duralay system is really that you can remove the bridge and then reposition it to verify the accuracy of the index. A disadvantage is that on completion of the soldering procedure, no record remains to verify the fit of the procedure itself, as does with a plaster occlusal index. The material is allowed to set, and once completely set, carefully remove the bridge and inspect that a complete meniscus has indeed been formed. Similar to the previous procedure, you do not want any investment in the area of the connector during the soldering. Then reseat the bridge and verify that indeed you have obtained an accurate record of the relationship of the two components of the fixed partial denture. Once satisfied, you can remove it and proceed with the next step. Again, a little soldering investment is mixed, and either carefully by hand or under light vibration, fill the two retainers. Make certain that you do not trap any air bubbles to prevent formation of a heat sink, as discussed earlier. Once both retainers have been filled, you can take a little bit of the material, and it should have a nice creamy consistency, and place it on a slab, and then carefully position the assembled bridge onto the soldering investment. Gently rock it in place. Try not to submerge it. It'll just end up giving you more work later on. And then cover the area of the first connector to protect it from remelting and possibly affecting the accuracy of the procedure. It is helpful to keep quite a bit of the ponic exposed, although it's not always possible at this stage, and you may wish to elect to cover the margin of the modified 3/4 crown. After the material is set, it is again carved into the desired shape, and note the airways and the ready access for the tip of the soldering flame into the connector area. The block has been rounded to minimize its size and to make heating of the entire assembly much easier. The entire block is now placed in the burnout oven, and the assembly is heated to approximately 900 degrees, during which the duralay will burn off without leaving any residue. A strip of solder is wetted with some flux, and the excess is removed by wiping the strip on a paper towel. A small amount of flux is now carried into the connector area, and the trick here is to do it rather rapidly. Because of the heat, the flux immediately turns into a chalky white color, and you have to carry it rapidly to where you want it. The assembly, as preheated, is again placed over a Bunsen burner, and some of the strip solder is fed into the connector area. Again, remember to keep the torch in motion and try to direct the heat into the area of the connector. Note that it again flows into the joint, and inspect at this time that a complete meniscus is once again formed. Once satisfied, you can clean the bridge, pickle it, and inspect the size of the connectors and test them for their strength. The complete meniscus should have been formed. A proper solder joint cannot be broken by force of hand, so give it to your neighbor or your lab instructor and have them verify that your solder joints indeed satisfy that requirement. Don't kid yourself at this time. It's best to find out now that you have a joint with a void or a deficiency rather than after a prosthesis has been cemented in a patient's mouth. You can return the bridge to the master cast for preliminary finishing and for the verification of the fit.